The prophecy had been the singular anchor of Magnus's existence for 500 years. A tedious, infuriatingly vague, yet desperately clutched at anchor in an ocean of monotonous crimson nights. When the moon weeps silver on the steel steeds of man, a being of light shall appear. She who walks the line between life and death shall be thy salvation, the dawn to thy endless gloaming. 4 centuries, his finest seers and scholars had debated its meaning. Steel steeds, they'd concluded after witnessing the first primitive automobile, were the cursed, fume-belching carriages of the modern age. The moon weeping silver was clearly the glint of celestial light upon their metallic hides. It was all very poetic. Magnus had found it mostly inconvenient. The search, which had once involved scouring mystical glens and hallowed temples for ethereal priestesses, had in the last century devolved into skulking around late-night diners and bus stations. Tonight, the portents, the alignments, the very thrum of the blood in the air had led him here. To this. A hospital parking lot. The reek of antiseptic and despair clung to the air, a far cry from the sacred incense he'd imagined. The steel steeds were a depressing assortment of dented sedans and sensible minivans. The weeping moon was just the sickly orange glow of sodium vapor lamps reflecting off a Toyota Camry with a questionable bumper sticker. This could not be right. His ancient, all-powerful senses, honed over a millennium of predatory dominance, were being assaulted by the scent of stale coffee and microwaved popcorn. He was Magnus, the Shadow King, the Lord of 1,000 years, and he was hiding behind a dumpster that smelled faintly of regret and medical waste. Then he saw her. She emerged from a sliding glass door, a beacon not of celestial radiance, but of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Her scrubs were a faded, indeterminate blue. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun from which several strands had given up and committed suicide. She walked with the determined shuffle of someone whose entire soul had been systematically ground into a fine powder over a 12-hour shift. Magnus felt a jolt, a pull that resonated deeper than logic. It was her. The prophecy hummed in his veins, an insistent, undeniable thrum. This was the being of light. This creature of profound weariness. She looked less like a harbinger of salvation and more like someone who had just lost a prolonged argument with a vending machine. He swept from the shadows, a spectre of midnight silk and honed power. Theatrics were essential. Fear was the key that unlocked respect. He had practiced the opening line for 2 centuries. It was a masterpiece of gravitas and menace. He materialized before her, blocking her path to a beat-up hatchback. He allowed his cloak to swirl, a carefully calculated gesture of dark majesty. He let the ancient power flicker in his eyes, a glimpse of the abyss that lay behind them. "You," he intoned, his voice a low rumble that had made armies tremble. The woman stopped. She blinked slowly, her focus taking a moment to adjust. She looked him up and down, from the tips of his polished Italian leather boots to the artfully severe cut of his obsidian hair. Her expression was not one of fear. It was not one of awe. It was the flat, profoundly unimpressed look of a person who has recently been sneezed on by a man with pneumonia. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy with fatigue. "Or are you just auditioning for a local theater production of Dracula?" Magnus's brain, an organ that had processed the fall of empires and the birth of nations, stalled. It was like a magnificent clockwork machine into which someone had just jammed a used Q-tip. Dracula? That overwrought, histrionic buffoon? The insult was so pedestrian, so utterly mortal, it was stunning. He recalibrated. She was clearly in shock. Yes, that was it. Her mind was protecting itself from the sheer, overwhelming reality of his presence. He must be direct. He leaned in, letting his fangs descend a fraction of an inch, a subtle, terrifying hint of the predator beneath. "I have sought you for centuries. I have crossed oceans of time to find you. I am Magnus, the Vampire King." She sighed. It was not a gasp of terror. It was a sigh that originated in her feet and carried with it the weight of every bedpan she'd ever emptied. "And I'm Alara, a night shift nurse," she retorted, shifting a worn tote bag on her shoulder. "My sleep schedule is scarier than yours, I guarantee it. Now, if you'll excuse me, Count Chocula, you're standing between me and a burrito the size of my head. and I'm not sure which one of you I'm more likely to bite. Count Chocula. The words echoed in the vast, silent halls of his mind. He, Magnus, who had made Byzantine emperors weep for their mothers. He, whose name was a curse whispered in the dark. He had just been compared to a cartoon character on a box of children's breakfast cereal. The prophecy had neglected to mention a required sense of humor. Or perhaps a profound level of insanity. This was a disaster. His entire 500-year plan was unraveling at the hands of a sarcastic, sleep-deprived mortal with a craving for Mexican food. He couldn't let her go. She was the key. The prophecy was never wrong. It was just, apparently, written by a comedian. There was only one course of action for a king faced with such unprecedented defiance. "You are coming with me," he declared, his voice regaining a sliver of its commanding tone. "Yeah, that's gonna be a no," Elara said, trying to step around him. "I have a date with my couch and a streaming service. It's a very committed relationship." He moved faster than she could track, a blur of shadow. One moment he was in front of her, the next he was behind her, his arm gently but immovably around her waist. He could feel the rigid shock that went through her body. Finally, a glimmer of appropriate fear. "Hey," she yelped, stiffening. "Unhand me, you velvet-clad weirdo. This is kidnapping. And assault. And you smell like old books and condescension." It was, perhaps, the most articulate protest he had ever received from a victim. "A necessity," he murmured into her ear, ignoring the surprisingly astute olfactory analysis. He swept her off her feet. She was lighter than he expected, but she writhed with the surprising strength of a cornered badger. "Put me down. I am not a sack of potatoes. I just clocked out. This is officially the worst commute of my life." He ignored her, striding toward the darkest corner of the parking lot where the shadows coalesced into a tangible darkness, a gateway to his domain. The world warped around them, the scent of asphalt and antiseptic replaced by the cool, damp smell of ancient stone and ozone. "Oh, great," Elara grumbled, her voice muffled against his chest. "A magic portal. You couldn't just spring for an Uber Black like a normal, civilized kidnapper." Magnus stepped through the threshold, the familiar chill of his fortress enveloping them. The portal sealed behind them with a sound like tearing silk. He was home. He was in his sanctum, his seat of power. He had secured the being of light. He set her down in the center of his throne room. The chamber was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness, held aloft by pillars carved to resemble tormented souls. The only light came from a grand, blood-red moon that shone through a massive rose window, casting crimson shadows across the polished obsidian floor. It was a chamber designed to inspire terror and awe. Elara looked around, her eyes scanning the cavernous space. She rubbed her arms. "Okay, first off, the decor is a little on the nose, don't you think? It's very high school goth's bedroom, but with a budget. And secondly, you really need to look into some central heating. I think my nipples just tried to cut glass." Magnus stared at her. His minions, ancient and powerful vampires in their own right, materialized from the surrounding gloom, their eyes glowing with faint red light. They were his royal guard, creatures of nightmare. One of them, Gideon, his majordomo for the last 3 centuries, glided forward. "My lord," Gideon began, his voice a sibilant whisper. "You have returned. And you have brought a snack." Elara's head whipped toward him. "Excuse me? Did you just call me a snack?" "Buddy, I'm a whole, unsatisfying, 3-course meal of bad decisions and caffeine dependency. You don't want this." Gideon recoiled, his fangs retracting in surprise. He looked at Magnus, his expression a mask of pure confusion. Magnus felt a headache forming behind his temples. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced since the Protestant Reformation. "She is not a snack, Gideon," Magnus said, his voice tight. "She is, the one from the prophecy." A collective, silent shock rippled through the assembled vampires. They stared at Elara, then back at their king, their ancient minds clearly struggling to reconcile the epic grandeur of the prophecy with the small, sarcastic woman currently inspecting a tapestry and picking a piece of lint off her scrubs. "Ha!" Gideon whispered, incredulous. The being of light. My lord, with all due respect, she appears to be aggressively beige. I can hear you, Nosferatu, Elara called out, not even looking at them. And for the record, this is surgical blue. It's a very calming color. Apparently not for you guys. She turned to face Magnus, her hands on her hips. All right, tall, dark, and brooding. Let's get a few things straight. I've been abducted from my place of work, teleported to what I assume is your mother's basement, and insulted by your butler. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I am dangerously low on patience. So, what, exactly, is the game plan here? Am I a prisoner? A sacrifice? Are you going to harvest my organs? Because if so, I'd like to state for the record that my liver has seen some things and you might want to ask for a refund. Magnus ran a hand over his face. He felt an emotion he hadn't encountered in centuries. He felt flustered. He, the vampire king, was flustered. You are not a sacrifice, he said, striving for a tone of regal authority that felt increasingly hollow. You are a guest. A guest, she shot back, her eyebrow arching. Did you miss the part where you manhandled me into a spooky vortex? Guests usually get an invitation, maybe a nice bottle of wine. I got a potential hernia and a critique of my wardrobe. The circumstances were unorthodox, Magnus conceded. Unorthodox is when the hospital cafeteria serves mystery meat. This is a federal crime. She paused, her gaze sweeping over him again. Okay. So I'm your guest. What do guests get around here? Is there coffee? Please tell me there's coffee. And if you tell me you only have decaf, I will find a way to set this whole drafty castle on fire. Don't test me. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was almost breathtaking. She was threatening him with arson over a caffeinated beverage. In his own throne room. Surrounded by 24 creatures who could tear her limb from limb without blinking. And the most infuriating part? He was curious to see if she could do it. Gideon, Magnus said, his voice flat. See to it that our guest is provided with coffee. Gideon bowed stiffly, his expression one of pained bewilderment. At once, my lord. The, regular kind? The kind that could restart a dead man's heart, Elara answered for him, a glimmer of something approaching enthusiasm in her eyes. And if you have any of those little biscotti, I wouldn't say no. Gideon vanished into the shadows, muttering about the utter collapse of societal norms. Magnus was left alone with her again. The crimson moonlight painted her face, and for a fleeting moment, he saw it. Not a celestial glow, but the faint, weary light of a woman who stood on the precipice of life and death every single day and fought like hell to keep people on the right side of it. The line from the prophecy echoed in his mind. She who walks the line between life and death. He'd always assumed it meant a necromancer, or a Valkyrie. He'd never once considered it could mean a nurse. So, Elara said, breaking the silence. While Lurch is off brewing my lifeblood, you want to give me the CliffsNotes version of why I'm here? I'm assuming it has something to do with that being of light nonsense. It is not nonsense, Magnus said, a defensive edge to his tone. It is a 500-year-old prophecy that foretells my salvation. Your salvation? She laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. Honey, look at me. I'm no one's salvation. I'm the person who tells you your insurance doesn't cover the procedure. The best I can offer you is a Tylenol and some lukewarm water. He found himself stepping closer, drawn by an inexplicable force. The prophecy has never been wrong. Well, there's a first time for everything, she said, her sarcasm a shield. But he saw, for the first time, a flicker of something else in her eyes. Not fear. Uncertainty. The bravado was a practiced defense, a wall built over years of facing down trauma and tragedy. He recognized it, for his own walls were ancient and far taller. Gideon reappeared, holding a silver tray upon which sat a steaming black mug. It looked profoundly out of place in his clawed, pale hands. Elara took it without hesitation, wrapping her hands around its warmth. She took a long, deep sip. Her eyes closed in a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss. Then they snapped open. She stared into the mug, her expression shifting to one of deep disappointment. What is this? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "It is coffee, my lady," Gideon offered. "From the finest beans, ground by hand." "It tastes like dirt and sadness," Elara declared, cutting him off. She looked at Magnus. "You've had 500 years to perfect a simple cup of coffee, and this is the best you can do. I am so disappointed in your entire immortal existence right now." Magnus stared at her, the mug, his throne room, and the utter surreality of his situation. The being of light, his prophesied salvation, was critiquing his hospitality. He had a sinking feeling this was going to be a very, very long eternity. And for the first time in centuries, he wasn't entirely sure he minded. The next few days, or nights, rather, as Magnus quickly learned, Elara maintained her nocturnal schedule with a fierce, territorial devotion settled into a rhythm of sustained absurdity. Magnus had envisioned a period of reverent orientation, where the being of light would slowly acclimate to her grand destiny, perhaps with tutorials on ancient lore and demonstrations of his formidable power. Instead, he got interior design feedback. "You know," Elara said on the third night, wandering into his library with a piece of toast, "for a place with this much square footage, your lighting is just atrocious. It's all moody uplighting. How does anyone read in here? Do you all just have super vampire vision? Because I'm getting serious eye strain just looking for the bathroom." Magnus looked up from a 1,000-year-old scroll detailing the blood rites of the Scythian kings. He was seated in a massive, throne-like chair carved from petrified wood. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. The ambience was, he had always felt, perfect. "We do not require the garish glare of mortal lighting," he stated. "Yeah, well, this mortal does," she countered, squinting at the shelves that soared into the darkness above. "And what is with all the skulls? Is there a discount at the skull store I don't know about? It feels less like a timeless fortress of power and more like you let a teenager with a Hot Topic credit card do the decorating." His jaw tightened. The skulls were from his most formidable vanquished enemies. Each one told a story of conquest and glory. "They are trophies. They're dust collectors," she said, taking a bite of toast. "You need some plants. A nice ficus, maybe a snake plant. They're very low maintenance. It would really brighten the place up. And a throw pillow. Honestly, a pop of color wouldn't kill you. Metaphorically speaking." He had no response. None. He, who could debate philosophy with the ghost of Marcus Aurelius, was rendered mute by a suggestion of decorative foliage. His minions were equally useless. They regarded Elara with a mixture of terror and fascination, like she was a strange, unpredictable woodland creature that might either bite them or ask for the Wi-Fi password. Which she had. Repeatedly. "There is no Wi-Fi," Gideon had explained, his voice strained. "We communicate via scrying pools and telepathic messaging. So you can't get Netflix?" Elara had asked, aghast. "How do you live? What do you do all night?" "Just lurk." That sounds incredibly boring. The sheer pragmatism of her worldview was a battering ram against the gothic melodrama of his. He tried to impress her. He showed her his collection of priceless artifacts, treasures plundered from the tombs of forgotten pharaohs. She'd picked up a canopic jar. "Does this open? I need a place to keep my pens." He took her to the grand balcony overlooking the jagged peaks of his domain, a landscape of perpetual twilight under a bruised purple sky. Behold, he'd swept his arm wide, "My kingdom. All that the darkness touches is mine." She'd leaned on the balustrade. "Nice view. Bit of a fixer-upper, though. The property taxes must be a killer." Nothing worked. Every attempt at grandeur was met with a sarcastic quip. Every display of power was treated as a mild inconvenience. He once turned into a swarm of bats out of sheer frustration, a terrifying display that had sent entire villages into panicked prayer. Elara had just waved a hand in front of her face. Gross. It's like a cloud of flying rats. Are any of you going to get stuck in my hair? Because that's a hard pass." Yet, beneath his mounting exasperation, something else was taking root. A strange, unfamiliar warmth. No one had spoken to him like this in 1,000 years. His subjects revered him. His enemies feared him. His lovers, in the brief, fleeting times he had taken them, had been enthralled by his power and darkness. They were all playing a part in the grand, somber opera of his existence. Ilara wasn't playing a part. She wasn't impressed by the opera. She was sitting in the audience, eating popcorn, and pointing out that the tenor's fly was down. He found himself watching her. The way she'd discovered the castle's kitchens and, after deeming their contents anemic and pretentious, had instructed a terrified vampire cook on the proper way to make a grilled cheese sandwich. The way she hummed off-key while she searched for a room with decent cell service. The way her face would soften when she spoke of her patients, her sarcastic armor momentarily falling away to reveal a fierce, bone-deep compassion. One evening, he found her in the library again. She wasn't critiquing the decor. She was standing before a towering shelf, her head tilted, reading the titles. Lamentations of the Damned, she read aloud. An illustrated history of impalement, 101 uses for a blood golem. You really need to expand your literary horizons. Have you ever read a good mystery? A romance novel? I have no use for such frivolous mortal fantasies, Magnus said, gliding to a stop beside her. Frivolous? Please, she scoffed. A good romance has more intrigue and backstabbing than half your history books, I bet. And way better dialogue. She pulled a heavy, leather-bound tome from the shelf. It was his personal journal, centuries of his thoughts and campaigns bound together. He tensed, ready to snatch it from her. But she didn't try to open it. She just ran a finger over the worn cover. You're lonely, aren't you? The question was so direct, so devoid of artifice or mockery, that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. I am a king, he said, his voice stiffer than usual. I am surrounded by my court. That's not what I asked. She looked at him, her gaze clear and startlingly perceptive. All these books, all these skulls, this big, empty castle. It's a lot of noise to fill up a whole lot of silence. You're the boss. Everyone's scared of you. Who do you talk to? I mean, really talk to? He had no answer. There was Gideon, but their relationship was one of master and servant, centuries of protocol between them. There were others, but they were vassals, not friends. Friendship was a mortal concept, a fleeting bond for creatures with fleeting lives. He had shed such things long ago. Loneliness is a mortal affliction, he said, the words tasting like ash. Bool, she said softly. Loneliness is universal. It's why people in the ER hold my hand so tight when they're scared. It's why you abduct a random nurse from a parking lot based on some mystical mumbo-jumbo. You weren't looking for salvation, Dracula. You were looking for company. A sarcastic comment rose to his lips, a denial, a piece of grand theatre to deflect the truth of her words. But it wouldn't come. He simply stood there, exposed by this small woman in blue scrubs, in a way no enemy's blade ever could. Before he could formulate a reply, a chilling screech echoed from the throne room, a sound of violated wards and trespassing magic. Magnus was instantly transformed. The flicker of vulnerability in his eyes was replaced by the cold fire of a predator. He moved, a blur of motion, placing himself between Ilara and the doorway. Stay here, he commanded, his voice a low growl. What was that? She asked, her own demeanor shifting, a spark of alarm in her eyes. Business, he said grimly. That requires my attention. He swept from the room, his cloak billowing behind him like wings of night. He left her standing there, among the books and the silence, the echo of her question hanging in the air between them. In the throne room, the air crackled with hostile energy. Kneeling in the center of the obsidian floor was one of his border guards, his armor scorched, his face pale with more than the usual vampiric pallor. Before him, shimmering in the air, was a projection of a face Magnus knew all too well. Lord Valerus. His rival for centuries. A slick, cruel vampire with a penchant for dramatics that rivaled Magnus's own, but without any of the underlying substance. Valerus's projected face smirked, his fangs glinting. Magnus, the image purred. Redecorating? I don't recall this much. Mortal. Stench in the air last time I visited. Valerus, Magnus's voice was dangerously soft. You grow bold. To breach my wards is an act of war. Oh, please. It was a simple message. A warning, if you will. I hear whispers. The great Magnus, holing up in his fortress. Has the old wolf lost his teeth? Or has he perhaps found a new pet? I hear she's a being of light, how quaint. A cold rage, precise and absolute, settled over Magnus. He would not discuss Ilara with this filth. You have 5 seconds to withdraw your foul presence from my home before I hunt you down and personally tear that insipid smirk from your face, Magnus said, each word a chip of ice. Valerus's smirk only widened. Temper, temper. I just wanted to let you know that the old ways are dying, Magnus. Your obsession with prophecies and destiny is a weakness. The new age of blood is coming, and it has no place for relics like you. Watch your back. The image dissolved, leaving only the scent of ozone and cheap cologne. Magnus stood in silence for a long moment, the rage churning within him. Valerus was a nuisance, a jackal snapping at his heels, but his timing was an ill omen. His mention of Ilara, it meant word had spread. She was no longer just his baffling houseguest. She was a target. A perceived weakness. The thought of any harm coming to her ignited a feeling in his chest so fierce, so violently protective, it startled him. He had brought her here. He had placed her in this danger. His quest for salvation had made her vulnerable. He turned and strode back towards the library. He found her right where he'd left her, though she now held his journal in her hands, her expression unreadable. What was all that? She asked, her voice quiet. Sounded like a bad guy monologue from a cheap action movie. A rival, Magnus said, his tone clipped. Lord Valerus. A viper who fancies himself a dragon. And he knows I'm here, it wasn't a question. Magnus nodded grimly. He does. She looked down at the journal in her hands, then back at him. You know, for someone who smells like condescension, you have surprisingly neat handwriting. She traced a finger over his name, embossed on the cover. This Valerus guy, is he a real threat? He is an annoyance I have tolerated for too long. That's not an answer. Her gaze was steady, demanding honesty. For the first time, he saw not a critic or a sarcastic commentator, but a partner in this bizarre situation. Someone who deserved the truth. Yes, Magnus admitted, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. He is a threat. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. Okay. Good to know. She held out the journal to him. You should probably keep this somewhere safer. Seems like the kind of thing a supervillain would love to read. He took it from her, their fingers brushing. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. It was warm. He hadn't felt true warmth in 500 years. He looked from her hand to her face. The sarcastic nurse, the unimpressed captive, she was still there. But so was someone else. Someone strong, and perceptive, and someone who made the silence of his castle feel a little less empty. He will not touch you, Magnus vowed, the words coming from a place deeper and more certain than any prophecy. I will not allow it. Ilara watched him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't have a witty retort. She just offered a small, tired, but genuine nod. And in the moody, ridiculously underlit library, surrounded by the trophies of 1,000 conquests, Magnus felt a different kind of victory. He had her attention. And he was terrified to realize just how much he wanted to keep it. The fragile truce of their strange cohabitation was shattered. Valerus's threat lingered in the air like a foul miasma, changing the dynamic from one of absurd kidnapping to something far more serious. Magnus found his ancient predatory instincts, usually directed outward at his enemies, now focused entirely inward, on the castle and its new, bewilderingly vulnerable occupant. He doubled the patrols along the shadow paths. He reinforced the ancient wards, pouring his own blood and will into the stones until they hummed with a power that made the air tremble. He became a brooding, omnipresent specter of security. Ilara, naturally, found it irritating. Do you have to lurk? She asked one night, turning from the ridiculously large kitchen fireplace where she was attempting to toast a bagel on a long fork. She jumped as she found him standing less than 3 feet behind her, silent as the grave. I am ensuring your safety, he stated, his arms crossed over his chest. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, watching her. It was research. You're ensuring I have a cardiac event before I've had my morning coffee, she shot back, waving the fork at him. This is a castle, not a high-security prison. I can't even go to the bathroom without one of your creepy bat boys materializing in the hallway to ask if I require assistance. I do not require assistance. It's a bathroom, not the final puzzle in an escape room. Their presence is for your protection. Their presence is creepy. One of them, Gideon, I think, complimented my choice of pajamas. They have little cartoon sheep on them, Magnus. It was a deeply unsettling moment for both of us. Magnus made a mental note to have a firm word with Gideon about social boundaries. The concept was, admittedly, new to their entire civilization. His paranoia was not unfounded. Valerus began to test the perimeter, not with a direct assault, but with insidious, probing attacks. Whispers would slither through keyholes, promising power to any of Magnus's court who would betray him. Illusions would flicker at the edges of the parapets, images of fire and destruction. Minor curses, designed to sour the blood stores and cause discord, were found like venomous spiders in the castle's larder. Magnus dealt with each incursion with brutal efficiency, but the constant pressure began to wear on him. Sleep, already a foreign concept, became an impossibility. He grew more withdrawn, the shadows under his eyes deepening until he looked less like a king and more like a wraith. Ilara noticed. Of course, she noticed. She noticed everything. You look like crap, she announced, finding him in the armory, staring at a wall of medieval weaponry. A poet, as always, he muttered, not turning around. He was tracing the edge of a cursed broadsword with a single finger. No, seriously, she persisted, walking up to stand beside him. You're pale. I know, pale is kind of your whole brand, but this is a new level. It's I see you pale, you're stressed. The situation is under control. Is it? She challenged. Because you're spending all your time playing whack-a-mole with this Valerus guy's magic tricks, and you look like you're about to fall over. When was the last time you fed? The question was so practical, so typically her, that it caught him off guard. He fed when he needed to, from blood banks and willing donors from his protected domains. But the ritual had become rote, a matter of sustenance rather than pleasure or strength. He realized, with a jolt, that it had been weeks since he had taken more than the bare minimum. It is not your concern, he said, his voice sharp. It is my concern when my kidnapper-turned-bodyguard looks like he's running on fumes, she countered, her tone softening slightly. You can't protect me if you're running on empty. That's basic human or, I guess, inhuman physiology. He finally turned to look at her. The concern in her eyes was genuine, stripped of its usual sarcastic armor. It was unnerving. It made his chest ache with a feeling he couldn't name. I am fine, he lied. You're a terrible liar, she said, and then did something that shocked him more than any of Valerus's attacks. She reached out and placed a hand on his forearm. Her skin was warm. The contact was brief, but it sent a cascade of fire through his cold veins. He flinched back as if burned. Her hand dropped, and a flicker of hurt crossed her face before she masked it. Right. Personal space. Got it. Look, just take care of yourself, okay? I'd rather not be stuck here with Lurch and the Bat Boys if you keel over from magical exhaustion. She turned and left the armory, leaving him staring after her. The spot on his arm where she had touched him tingled. It was a phantom heat, a memory of life against his deathless skin. And it terrified him. The prophecy called her his salvation, but he was beginning to fear she would be his undoing. This strange, mortal warmth was a distraction. A vulnerability. And Valerus was an expert at exploiting vulnerabilities. The attack came 3 nights later. It was not a whisper or an illusion. It was a storm. Magnus was on the highest tower, watching the roiling, unnatural clouds gather above his domain when the ward screamed. Not a single point of pressure, but a dozen at once. Valerus wasn't probing, he was invading. Gideon. Magnus's voice boomed, carrying on the wind. To me. The rest of you, find Ilara. Protect her. Do not let her out of your sight. He didn't wait for a reply. He launched himself from the tower, his cloak snapping into vast, leathery wings. He became a creature of the storm, a dark angel descending into the fray. Valerus's shock troops were grotesque creations, vampires twisted by dark alchemy, their bodies warped into bestial forms with too many limbs and razor-sharp claws. They swarmed the battlements, crashing against the lines of Magnus's royal guard. Magnus was a whirlwind of destruction. He moved through the enemy ranks like a scythe through wheat, his ancient power a palpable force that shattered bone and tore flesh. But for every one he destroyed, 2 more seemed to scrabble over the walls. This was a full-scale assault, an attempt to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. He caught a glimpse of Valerus himself across the courtyard, a sneering, elegant figure directing the chaos from afar, a cruel smile on his face. He was holding something in his hand, a blade that seemed to drink the very light from the air, its edges glowing with a faint, sickly green luminescence. Rage gave Magnus strength. The thought of that viper being so close to Alara was unacceptable. He cut a bloody path across the courtyard, his eyes locked on his rival. "Tired of hiding behind your pets, Valerus?" Magnus roared over the din of battle. "I merely wanted a front-row seat to watch your kingdom burn, old friend," Valerus called back, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "And to deliver a personal message." He moved with a speed that surprised Magnus. He wasn't a brawler, Valerus had always been a schemer, a politician. But now he fought with a desperate, vicious energy. Their swords met in a shower of sparks, the shriek of cursed metal on ancient steel echoing through the courtyard. They were evenly matched in speed and strength, but Magnus had centuries more experience. He parried, he feinted, he drove Valerus back step by step. He saw an opening, a flicker of weakness in Valerus's guard, and he lunged. It was a trap. As Magnus's sword swept in for the killing blow, Valerus dropped his own blade and darted inside Magnus's reach, the sickly green dagger appearing in his other hand. Magnus tried to pull back, but it was too late. The cursed blade plunged deep into his side, just below his ribs. A fire unlike any he had ever known erupted in his body. It was not the clean, hot pain of a normal wound. This was a vile, corrosive agony that seemed to attack his very essence. His magic, the power that would normally knit his flesh back together in seconds, recoiled from the wound, sizzling and useless against the blade's potent curse. He staggered back, a guttural cry torn from his throat. He ripped the dagger out and hurled it away, but the damage was done. The green-black poison was already spreading through his veins, a network of agonizing fire. Valerus laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. A gift from the spider witches of the sunken fen. It devours magic, Magnus. It devours life. Even yours. Enjoy your long, slow death. With a final, mocking salute, Valerus dissolved into a cloud of black mist and was gone, the assault ending as abruptly as it began. His twisted minions, their master gone, shrieked and fled back into the night. Silence fell over the courtyard, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Magnus pressed a hand to his side. The blood that flowed from the wound was sluggish and black, steaming where it hit the cold stones. The world began to tilt, the edges of his vision blurring into a grey haze. "My lord." Gideon was at his side, his face a mask of horror as he saw the wound. "The curse," Magnus gasped, the pain making it hard to form words. "My magic, it does nothing." He could feel his immortality fraying at the edges, the great, ancient power within him being consumed by the venom. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Magnus, the Shadow King, felt the cold, inexorable pull of death. He collapsed to his knees, his strength failing him. His last conscious thought was not of his kingdom, or his power, or his ancient enemy. It was a single, panicked question that echoed in the encroaching darkness of his mind. Where was Alara? The chaos in the throne room was a symphony of useless panic. Magnus lay upon a hastily cleared banquet table, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old parchment. The wound in his side was a festering, black-edged crater, refusing to close, leaking a foul, dark ichor. His most powerful healers, ancient vampires whose knowledge of blood magic was legendary, hovered around him, wringing their hands and chanting futile incantations that sizzled and died a foot from his skin. "The venom is anchored to a necrotic curse, my lord Gideon," one of them wailed, his voice thin with terror. "It feeds on his grace. Our magic only strengthens it. Then do something else." Gideon roared, his usual composure shattered. He was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Use poultices, leeches, anything. Mortal remedies are useless against a curse of this magnitude. It was into this scene of high Gothic incompetence that Ilara burst, flanked by two hulking guards who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She had been locked in the library for her own safety, and from the furious look on her face, she had not appreciated it. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her eyes scanning the room. Then she saw him. Her breath hitched. The sarcasm, the annoyance, all of it evaporated from her face, replaced by a stark, focused intensity that silenced the room. In 2 seconds, she was at his side. The terrified healers scattered like startled crows as she leaned over Magnus, her expression grim. "What happened?" she snapped at Gideon, her voice the clipped, no-nonsense tone of an ER nurse in the middle of a code blue. "He was wounded," Gideon stammered. "A cursed blade. Magic cannot heal it." "Yeah, I got that part," she said, her fingers already at Magnus's throat, checking his pulse. It was thready, far too fast. His skin was cold, clammy. Pupils are sluggish. He's going into shock. She looked at the wound. She didn't flinch. She leaned closer, her nose wrinkling at the smell. "It's necrotizing. The tissue is dying. Forget magic, this is a medical problem now. I need supplies." She straightened up, and the full force of her authority hit the room like a physical wave. The tired, sarcastic woman was gone. In her place stood a commander, her voice sharp and absolute. She pointed at a healer. "Get me boiling water. A lot of it. And the cleanest linen you can find. Rip it into strips." She pointed at another. "I need light. Not this moody crap." She gestured at the flickering candelabras. "Get every candle you can find and bring them right here. And hold them steady, or so help me God, I will use you as a candle holder." The vampires stared at her, frozen in shock. "Now," she bellowed, and they scrambled to obey, their fear of their king's death momentarily eclipsed by their terror of this small, furious mortal. "Gideon," she said, her voice slightly lower but no less firm. "Talk to me. What was the blade coated in? What did the bad guy say?" "He called it a gift from the spider witches of the sunken fen," Gideon recited, his voice shaking. "He said it devours magic. Devours life. Spider witches. Great. That's helpful." Ilara was thinking, her mind racing. Spider venom. Necrotic properties. Okay. She had a baseline. "Are there any plants in this castle? An herb garden? Anything with antiseptic or anti-inflammatory properties?" "We have a conservatory, my lady," Gideon offered. "For the cultivation of night-blooming flora. Black orchids, moon petals, weeping moss. Does anything in there not sound like it belongs in a goth poem?" she muttered. "Fine. Anything that draws out poison? A folk remedy? Anything?" "There is, silver root," one of the younger guards spoke up, his voice hesitant. "It is said to purify that which is corrupt." "Good. Get it. And get me a knife and a brazier of hot coals. And wine. The strongest you have. Not for me, for this," she gestured at the wound. The minions flew to their tasks, a whirlwind of panicked, purposeful activity under her command. Within minutes, the throne room looked less like a king's court and more like a makeshift field hospital. A dozen vampires held candelabras aloft, bathing the table in a bright, flickering sea of light. Ilara worked. She poured the wine over the wound, cleaning away the black blood. Magnus groaned, a low, pained sound, but his eyes didn't open. She took the knife, heated its tip in the coals until it glowed red, and took a deep, steadying breath. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, more to herself than to him. With the precision of a surgeon, she began to debride the wound. She cut away the dead, blackened flesh at the edges, her movements quick and efficient. The smell was horrific. The sight was worse. But her hands were rock steady. This was her world. Not magic, not prophesize. Just flesh and blood, life and death. The line she walked every single day. Gideon brought her the silver root. It was a gnarled, pale thing that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. She crushed it with the hilt of the knife, mixing it with a bit of the wine to create a thick paste. "Hold him down," she ordered. Gideon and another guard placed their hands on Magnus's shoulders. Ilara packed the poultice into the cleaned wound. The effect was instantaneous. Magnus screamed, a roar, agonized sound that echoed off the high ceilings. His back arched off the table. The curse was fighting back. Black, smoky tendrils rose from the wound, lashing out at the silver root paste, which glowed with a soft, pure white light in response. It was a battle of corruption and purity, of venom and remedy, playing out in his flesh. "Hold him," Ilara yelled. For a long, terrible minute, he thrashed against them, his body convulsing. The light from the poultice flared, and the black tendrils dissolved with a final, hissing shriek. And then, he was still. The room was silent, save for the sound of Ilara's ragged breathing. She was covered in sweat and blood, his blood. She placed her fingers on his neck again. The pulse was still fast, but it was stronger. Steadier. She took the linen strips and began to bandage the wound, her movements gentle now. The immediate crisis was over. The poison was neutralized. Now it was just a wound. A bad one, but one that could heal. She finished her work and finally took a step back, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush. She felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it almost buckled her knees. She looked down at the vampire king, the ancient, powerful being who had abducted her and turned her life upside down. He looked diminished, vulnerable. Just a man, pale and unconscious on a table, saved by boiling water, a garden route, and the steady hands of a night shift nurse. Gideon approached her, his eyes wide with a reverence that made her uncomfortable. You saved him," he whispered. The prophecy, a being of light, his gaze flickered from her to the sea of candles she had commanded. "She who walks the line between life and death." Ilara just shook her head, too tired to even be sarcastic. "I'm a nurse, Gideon," she said, her voice heavy. "It's what I do." She sank into a nearby chair, the full weight of the night crashing down on her. She had just performed emergency surgery on a mythical creature in a Gothic castle by candlelight. She was fairly certain this wasn't covered by her malpractice insurance. Magnus drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, cold ocean. The first thing he registered was not pain, but its absence. The all-consuming, corrosive fire in his veins was gone, replaced by a clean, sharp ache in his side. A normal ache. A wound that was healing. The second thing he registered was the light. It wasn't the crimson gloom of his throne room. It was a soft, gentle glow. He forced his heavy eyelids open. He was in his own chambers. Sunlight, pale, wintry, but unmistakably sunlight, was filtering through the heavy velvet curtains, which had been drawn back just a few inches. The sight was so foreign it took him a moment to process. Someone had let the sun into his room. He should be burning. He should be dust. But the light only touched the far wall, a gentle promise rather than a threat. He tried to sit up and a sharp pain lanced through his side, forcing him back down with a groan. "Hey, take it easy, Dracula." The voice was soft, laced with a familiar, weary sarcasm. He turned his head. Ilara was sitting in a large armchair she had dragged next to his bed. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her scrubs were stained with his blood. But she was there, watching him. "You," he rasped, his throat dry. "Yeah, me," she said, a small, tired smile on her lips. She stood and came over, holding a goblet of water to his lips. He drank greedily. "Welcome back to the land of the living. Or, the UN living. Whatever." He lay back, his mind slowly piecing together the fractured memories. The battle. Valerus. The green blade. The agonizing, world-ending pain. And then, her voice. Sharp, commanding. Cutting through the haze of agony and despair. He looked at his side. Over the fine silk of his shirt, he could see the thick, clean lines of a bandage. A mortal bandage. "You healed me," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of awe. "The curse, my magic was useless. Turns out spiderwitch venom isn't immune to a good debridement and a whole lot of alcohol," she said, her tone attempting lightness, but her eyes were serious. "You had me worried for a minute there, Drama King. You were circling the drain." He stared at her, and the pieces of the prophecy, the words that had guided and tormented him for 500 years, slammed into place with the force of a revelation. It wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. It was also painfully, beautifully literal. A being of light. He had searched for a celestial, an angel, a creature of holy fire. He'd never considered the fluorescent lights of a hospital corridor. The focused beam of a penlight checking for pupillary response. The sea of candles she'd commanded to light her work. She who walks the line between life and death. He had imagined a necromancer, a goddess of the underworld. Not a woman in comfortable shoes who spent her nights fighting to keep human hearts beating, standing as a bulwark against the final darkness. His salvation wasn't some grand, mystical destiny. It was her. Practical, profane, unimpressed, and utterly brilliant. She hadn't saved him with magic. She had saved him with knowledge, with skill, with sheer, stubborn competence. A feeling washed over him, so powerful it dwarfed the memory of the curse. It was a humbling, terrifying, and exquisitely warm tide of emotion. It was respect. It was gratitude. It was a profound and absolute love that made his ancient, unbeating heart ache in his chest. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in centuries. The jokes, the grandiosity, the theatrical walls he'd built around himself crumbled to dust. There was only the truth, raw and vulnerable. The prophecy. "I was a fool. I thought it meant. I don't know what I thought. But I was wrong." She watched him, her expression softening. She saw it. The change in him. The absence of the king and the presence of the man. "It was never about a mystical power," he continued, his eyes locked on hers. "It was about you. Your light. Your strength. You stand in the face of death every day, and you are not afraid. You fight it with your hands and your mind. You saved me, not with magic, but with something infinitely more powerful. With yourself." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and took hers. He didn't flinch from her warmth this time. He held on as if she were his only anchor in the universe. "I think," he swallowed, the words feeling new and clumsy on his tongue. "I think I am in love with you, Elara." The night shift nurse. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. The wall of sarcasm she lived behind, the one built from exhaustion and emotional scar tissue, finally came down. "You're a real piece of work, you know that," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You abduct me, you have terrible coffee, you live in a place that's a fire hazard with a morbid decorating scheme, and you're the most dramatic, ridiculous, lonely man I've ever met." She squeezed his hand. "And I think, somewhere between the bad coffee and the near-death experience, I fell in love with you too, you velvet-clad weirdo." The catharsis was in the quiet sincerity of the moment. The jokes had stopped. The theatrics were over. All that was left was two profoundly different people from two different worlds, finding a common ground in their shared, unexpected connection. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of pure, heartfelt devotion. "I promise," he murmured against her skin, "to hire a barista." A watery laugh escaped her. "It's a start." She used her free hand to brush a lock of dark hair from his forehead. Her touch was gentle, proprietary. "You're going to need a lot of rest. And fluids. And you're going to stay in this bed until I say you can get up." "Doctor's orders." "Nurse's orders," he corrected softly, a faint smile touching his lips. "My orders," she confirmed, her own smile finally reaching her eyes. "You're my patient now. And I have an excellent track record." He looked at her, truly looked at her, the exhausted, fierce, brilliant woman who had complained about his decor and then saved his immortal life. The prophecy hadn't been about his salvation from an enemy, or a curse. It was about his salvation from himself. From the lonely, empty eternity he had been resigned to. She was the dawn to his endless gloaming. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the light.